That was Natalie Perhernan there for us. Let's bring in our panel now from Jakarta. I'm joined by Rakyan Adibrata. He's an advisor to the Indonesian government and an expert in counter-terrorism. Greg Barton is a professor of global Islamic politics at Australia's Deakin University. And Shoeb Kagda is the founder of the Indonesia Economic Forum and a former editor of the Jakarta Globe. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Full disclosure, for the record, we had a Prabowo supporter booked for the show who pulled out. We tried to get a replacement. It was very difficult for us. We tried very hard. So that's unfortunate. Shoeb, the last time we spoke, you said that Indonesian people are not idiots. Even though there was a lot of fake news out there, they would not be swayed by it. There was a torrent of lies, especially on social media. What does it say that the person who was most heavily affected by the fake news, Jokowi, still, it seems, managed to get the trust and the vote of the majority of Indonesians? What does that mean, Shoeb?
Well, it clearly means that voters have taken President Joko Widodo's promises to heart. They have not been swayed by the fake news campaigns and rumors that have been swirling around the country over the last 2-3 weeks. As I said, I think voters understand what this election is about. They have put their interest forward in terms of what they would like. We mentioned jobs. President Joko Widodo is promising millions of new jobs. Of course, we'll have to wait to see how those jobs are created in an economy, especially, I think, where growth at 5% is clearly not enough to create the 2 million new jobs that are required every year.
Rakyan, Joko Widodo over Prabowo Subianto. What was the crucial ingredient in his recipe that seems to have given him the job again?
One thing for sure, I believe what he promised can be delivered in the last 5 years, even though it's not a perfect thing, but still, it's still categorized as acceptable to among of the people, of the voters living in Indonesia.
A lot of people, Greg Barton, who support Prabowo are refusing to accept this for now. Has there been any evidence whatsoever that there was cheating?
There's been evidence of minor irregularities. There were papers turning up in Kuala Lumpur, complaints of getting into polling booths in foreign stations, the expected problems in remote provinces like Papua, but no evidence of any large-scale or systematic fraud. The system seemed to work pretty well. It's as robust and as efficient as you can imagine in a country of Indonesia's scale and challenges, and I don't think there's any reason to be doubting the results.
Okay, Shoeb, as Natalie had mentioned and as we had spoken about before, at the heart of the division in a very divisive electoral campaign was the concept of what does it mean to be religious, I guess, as an Indonesian, and Islam and the role of religion in politics. Are we any closer to solving that riddle now that it seems as if Joko Widodo is the next president, or the president has got another mandate?
Well, now that President Joko Widodo has more or less clinched the presidential elections, and his running mate is a Kiai, who is the head of the Muslim Religious Council in Indonesia. I think a lot of people and observers and Indonesians are going to watch exactly what role will the vice president play. Traditionally, the vice president has been the champion of the economy, while the president has focused his attention on the larger issues, especially on poverty reduction. And in the last 5 years, of course, Joko Widodo has been very focused on infrastructure. Now, the other key role that a vice president normally plays is to try and sell the president's vision and programs in parliament. So again, how effective will this current vice president, Maruf Amin, be in that role? So I think the jury is out in terms of whether or not Islam has been laid to rest in this election. I'm really curious to see how much of a role will this current vice president play, and what would be his main agenda? Because in the past he has talked about promoting a Sharia economy in Indonesia. What does that mean exactly? No one quite knows. But with him there, this whole idea, I think, is going to be raised again.
Right. Rakyan, what do you think Maruf Amin's agenda is, and how big of a role will he play?
Maruf Amin is the most important clerics and also the head of the ulama councils, the Islamic ulama councils in Indonesia. For sure, the plan of Mr. Jokowi is to involve the moderates, the Islamic moderate society, especially the Nahdlatul Ulama and also the Muhammadiyah, two most prominent Islamic mass organizations, to play the role in enhancing the cooperations and enhancing the role in countering radicalisms and violent extremisms in Indonesia.
Is violent extremism a problem right now, Rakyan?
For sure. Well, if you see, for example, the rise of conservatisms can run into a different, it can go the other way around and can create problems if cannot be nurtured very well.
Okay, so how is Jokowi's leadership of the past few years perhaps failed in addressing that and failed in putting an end to the root causes of violent extremism?
Well, there is no terrorism without radicalizations, and the seed of radicalizations is intolerance, even though not all intolerance can be radicalized, and not all radicalized can be a terrorist. But one thing for sure, with the rise of conservatism in Indonesia, and it being used rapidly by violent organizations, including the radical organizations, to spread their narrative, it will be really difficult if the governments, if the next presidencies cannot enhance the cooperations with the mass organizations, moderate Islamic mass organizations such as Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah. That's where the role of Vice President elected Maruf Amin can play along really well.
Okay, so Greg, these things are complicated issues, and it's easy to sort of quote mine and just presume that a comment here or a fatwa there might necessarily mean extremism. But do people have reason to be concerned if they look at the timeline and they look at the track record and they say, well, the guy who's going to be the vice president has issued fatwa or fatwas in the past against yoga and against gay people and so on, so that perhaps might suggest that the government will be moving in a certain direction?
Well, they should be concerned about that past track record, but I don't think they should assume that it means the government and the president's moving in that direction. Maruf Amin was not Jokowi's first choice. It was foisted upon him because party leaders didn't want the man that he wanted. But to be fair to Maruf Amin, he's moderated his views and performed well since the nomination. I don't expect him to be a spoiler or an upsetting influence in the government. I think the fact that he's not just there for himself or even for the Council of Ulama, he's there representing Nahdlatul Ulama to a large extent and the larger Muslim communities. And I think that will moderate what he does. So I'm cautiously optimistic, although I think we should always be concerned about the rise of identity politics. It did play a role in this election, but the world's most populous Muslim nation has shown itself a successful democracy, 5 elections in 2 decades. And I think, to give it credit, we should be optimistic about its capacity to deal with these things.
Yeah, so Shoeb, is it robust enough? Are there checks and balances at play here between the competing forces of pluralism and ultra-conservatism?
Yes, I think there are checks and balances. I think civil society in Indonesia has also come a long way. People are not afraid to speak up. If you watch closely social media, pushback on many of these fatwas that you just mentioned against yoga and against the gay community, there has been pushback. One other point that I would like to raise in terms of growing extremism, and this is where Maruf Amin could play an interesting role in my view, is to stop foreign funding of radicalized madrasas within Indonesia.
Where's it coming from?
And we all know where that money is coming from. That money is coming from Saudi Arabia. And when the king visited Indonesia recently, the red carpet was laid out for him. I would want to know what is Maruf Amin's point of view in terms of stopping this foreign funding into madrasas in Indonesia, especially into schools where they teach Wahhabism, which is one of the main, in my view, one of the main causes of the growing radicalization of Islam in Indonesia.
Okay, so Rakyan, given that this is up your alley, it's within your domain of expertise, do you draw a straight correlation between the Saudi funding of madrasas and mosques and so on, and a Salafi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, and radicalization?
Well, one thing for sure, the narrative that being spread out by the takfiris, the people who use terrorism as a tool to convey their message, they are indeed have a Wahhabism and Salafist influence on their narrative. But if we trace down whether it have a direct relations between terrorism in Indonesia with Saudi Arabia or the rise of radicalizations, I believe that's another thing that we need to discuss more further.
Okay, Shoeb, now beyond voting for the presidency, the numbers are extraordinary here. 250,000 candidates for more than 20,500 legislative seats at 5 levels of government, right? So it's not just about 2 guys jostling for a position here. What should we know about the rest of this massive election, the parliamentary elections? What are the trends that we should be aware of?
Well, yes, the parliamentary elections, in fact, kind of got subdued in these elections, but they were very critical because depending on which parties win enough votes to form enough seats in parliament will also determine the next coalition government, because Jokowi and PDIP, which is the party that supports him, will not have enough seats to form a government. So there will be a need to form coalitions. In the past, that coalition has included Golkar, which is, of course, a Suharto era party, but which is trying to reform itself. Nasdem, the National Democrats, some of the Islamic parties have also thrown their support behind Joko Widodo. So I think the parliamentary makeup and the commissions that are formed and who runs these commissions will be very critical in terms of how policies are dictated over the next 5 years.
Greg Barton, is coalition building going to be a messy process?
Less so than in previous years. We've seen a move towards a more stable 2-coalition system and 2-presidential contender system. It's much less the messy multi-party democracy that it was even 5 years ago. It's interesting that the radical Islamist parties have not increased their share of their votes significantly. That's on the side of Prabowo. We have stability on the coalition that Shoeb's just outlined that will support the president. So that augurs well for stability. I think that Indonesia is moving away from the really chaotic years in which party alliances and coalition memberships swung around at short notice to something that's going to be much more stable now.
Okay, do you agree with that, Rakyan?
Yes, I do agree with that.
Tell me what makes this time different. Has there been a maturity, a newfound maturity in 2019 to this process of parliamentary elections, especially, in your opinion, Rakyan?
Well, currently, if you compare with the previous 5 years, when Joko Widodo controlled the presidentials and sit as the president of the first time in Indonesia, he hasn't got any strong support from numbers of party. But comparing with right now, he already secured numbers of prominent parties like Golkar, PKB, and numbers of more. And I believe it's going to be a stable government in the next 5 years.
Shoeb, what kind of foreign policy can we expect? Closer to China, perhaps?
That is a good question. I think, Joko Widodo has actually come under quite severe criticism about getting too close to China. That again, but China is one of the major funders of his infrastructure program. So it will be interesting to see how his foreign policy shapes up. I think traditionally, Indonesia has also had very strong ties with the United States and with the West to a certain extent. But in the past few years, Western economies and especially Western companies have not been big investors in Indonesia. So going forward, I'd be interested to see how he woos foreign investors, because I don't think the Chinese alone will be able to boost economic growth and achieve the levels of foreign direct investments that Indonesia needs going forward.
Okay, Greg, so it seems as if Indonesia is less of a political football or economic football between the West and China, because the West, as Shoeb says, hasn't been that interested in recent years. Is that then does that naturally mean that Indonesia should be turning and leaning on the Chinese?
No, it doesn't. This is one of the big challenges facing the new Jokowi government. Indonesian economics, investment climate has been excessively nationalistic. Indonesia has quite reasonably been cautious about Chinese direct foreign investment and has one of the smallest ratios in the world. So despite the criticism against Jokowi, actually the Chinese don't have a large footprint. I think it's reasonable for that footprint to grow, but I also think there needs to be more investment from global investors around the world, but they need to have their confidence built by some degree of reforms to labour laws and some degree of reforms to foreign investment laws. Every country should be cautious about foreign investment, but in the Indonesian case, the balance has gone too far in one direction for some decades now. There's no great reason for believing that Jokowi is going to bring it back suddenly, but he's got the mandate and the stability to bring it back to the centre, and that's what he needs to go well above the 5% plus growth that we've been seeing for the last decade.
Right. So, Shoeb, there's a 5-year mandate, but you know better than I do how it works on the ground. How much time would the people give Joko Widodo before they feel restless and they feel like he's not doing the job that they elected him to do?
Well, he's had 5 years, so people have given him, I think, the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, even though he has not fulfilled a lot of his initial campaign promises. I think in this second round, and this is just my pure personal view, he probably has about 2 years to deliver, because after which, the clamor for the next elections will start, and in 2024. There will be a whole new slate of candidates coming forward, and many of them will be starting to position themselves, and some of them will be in the Jokowi government too. I know a few of them are already having an eye on the next elections and will be running as candidates. Now, which would then mean if they are in his cabinet, would they be just following his agenda, or will they be starting to create their own agendas and positioning themselves? So I think there's a 2-year runway here for the president to deliver on his promises.
It's been really great getting a deeper understanding of Indonesian politics with all three of you. Shoeb Kagda, Greg Barton, and Rakyan Adibrata. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.